On March 11, 1944, the chimney of a house in the Rue Le Sueur, in the heart of Nazi-occupied Paris, and only a few blocks from the Gestapo headquarters, caught on fire. Neighbors summoned the fire brigade, who broke into the house through the cellar and very soon called for the gendarmerie. A heap of dismembered human bodies lay beside the furnace, ready to be fed into the flames. The owner of the house, who was absent at the time, was a Dr. Marcel Petiot. He was very soon contacted for an explanation, and he whispered confidentially to the gendarme in charge that these were the bodies of pro-Nazi collaborators who had been executed by the French resistance and entrusted to him, a true patriot, for disposal. This story was, at least temporarily, accepted by the gendarmerie, who allowed Petiot to escape Paris. The newspaper Paris Soir reported that 2 vagrants had broken into the house and been burnt to death when their clothes caught fire as they warmed themselves beside the furnace. In his flight, Petiot made contact with the resistance and was able to publish several letters in their clandestine magazine, Resistance, under the name of Capitaine Henri Valéry, in which he proclaimed the innocence of the missing Petiot. In November, however, some months after the liberation of Paris by the Free French Army, he was found, arrested, and charged with the murder of 27 Jewish refugees. Marcel Petiot was born on January 17, 1897, in the town of Auxerre, some 100 miles south of Paris. Stories from his childhood have survived. He was a late bedwetter, and he delighted in taking young fledglings from their nest, poking out their eyes and watching them distractedly hurling themselves against the bars of a cage. He was expelled from school after school for unacceptable behavior, and at age 16 was charged with stealing mail from a letterbox. A court-appointed psychiatrist found Marcel to be an abnormal youth suffering from personal and hereditary problems, which limit to a large degree his responsibility for his acts. Consequently, the charge was dropped, and after further problems with his schooling, he eventually graduated in July 1915. Drafted into the French army in January 1916, Petiot was wounded and gassed in the trenches, and by 1918 was diagnosed as suffering from neurasthenia. At the time, he was on a charge of stealing drugs from casualty clearing stations and selling them. However, a commission of inquiry decided that this was a result of his psychological state, and he was discharged with a disability pension. After his release, Petiot enrolled in medical school on a fast-track course of study and received his degree from the Faculté de Médecine in Paris in December 1921. He set up a practice in the town of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, where he distributed leaflets extolling his own abilities. He soon had numerous patients, and in 1927 he was elected mayor and married. The couple had a son, and in 1933 they relocated to Paris. There, the 36-year-old doctor advertised again, claiming that he could cure fungi, red spots, goiter, tattoos, scars, tumors both benign and malignant, arteriosclerosis, anemia, obesity, diabetes, cardiac and renal deficiencies, arthritis, nervous depression, senility, colds, pneumonia, emphysema, asthma, tuberculosis, appendicitis, ulcers, syphilis, bone diseases, ailments of the heart, liver, and stomach. Despite the success of his practice, Petiot attracted the attention of the law on a number of occasions. In 1935, one Anna Coquille lodged a complaint concerning the death of her daughter, who had been treated by him for a mouth abscess, had not recovered consciousness, and died several hours later. The charge was dismissed, as was a charge in the same year of illegal handling of narcotics. But in 1936, Petiot was arrested for stealing a science textbook from a stall on the Boulevard Saint-Michel. He pleaded absent-mindedness due to his mental state at the time, and was committed to a private psychiatric hospital. 7 months later, he was discharged, and shortly afterward fined 25,000 francs for making false income tax returns, something, as he pointed out, that many other respectable French citizens did regularly. For several years after Petiot lived a blame-free life, he was relatively wealthy, owned several properties in and around Paris, and bought and sold valuable pieces of jewelry at auction. His many patients spoke fulsomely of his courtesy and attentiveness, although there were complaints that his methods of treating drug addiction were far from ethical. Then came the war with Germany, the surrender of the French army, and the occupation of Paris in 1940. Over the next 4 years, as the Gestapo and their French collaborators began rounding up Jewish citizens and dispatching them to the death camps, Petiot was in his element. He discreetly let it be known that he had access to an escape route to South America via Spain. He made appointments for refugees at his house on Rue Le Sueur. Ironically, its name means sweat, and perhaps persuaded them to have inoculations against diseases endemic in their destination. As a patriot, he asked no more than the costs of the journey, but inevitably they brought with them whatever valuables they could carry. None were ever heard of again. Even as Petiot disappeared into the Paris night, the gendarmes were investigating the house on Rue Le Sueur. It was obvious that no one had lived there for several years. Dust lay everywhere, and the many rooms were crowded with pieces of furniture and piles of ornaments. At the rear was a courtyard enclosed by a high wall so that it was concealed from the view of the neighbors. The outbuildings, which had originally housed the stable and servants' quarters, included the only clean room, a converted passage that was neatly furnished as a doctor's office. In the adjoining garage was a huge pile of quicklime, in which fragments of bone and flesh were visible. In the former stable was a manure pit, half filled with lime and more human remains. On the landing was a sack containing half a headless corpse, and at the bottom of the staircase, beside a pile of coal and bodies, was a blood-stained hatchet. Searching further, the investigators found a strange triangular chamber close to the doctor's office. It was empty except for 8 iron rings fixed to the wall, opposite a double wooden door which had no handle on its inside. A small spy hole through the wall gave a clear view of the iron rings. Investigators also found a banal collection of personal belongings on the premises. They included 22 used toothbrushes, 7 pairs of eyeglasses, 5 cigarette holders, 5 gas masks, 7 pocket combs, a black satin evening gown, a woman's hat, a man's white shirt, and a 3-piece suit. The remains from the lime pit and stove were examined by experts in forensic anthropology. Dr. Albert Paul reported that they had been able to identify the bones of only 10 subjects, but the number 10 is vastly inferior to the real one. There were no signs of knife or gunshot wounds, and someone with a knowledge of anatomy had dissected the corpses with professional care, but the identity of the victims remained unknown. Petiot's trial opened on March 18, 1946, and lasted nearly 3 weeks. Searching one of the houses that Petiot owned near Auxerre, the police had recovered more than 80 suitcases containing some 2,000 items of clothing, including several German uniforms. These were to prove dramatic evidence, and, tellingly, only one former member of the resistance appeared in support of Petiot. His first victim was a patient, a Polish furrier named Joachim Guschinow. Petiot claimed that he had been paid with 5 matching sable furs, and that he had subsequently received 3 letters from the furrier in South America. The roll call of the missing continued. All of them, said Petiot, had been working for the Germans in one way or another. However, his defense began to fall apart when the final victims were named. These were the Neller family, German Jews who had fled from their homeland before the war. They had a 7-year-old son whose pajamas had been found in one of the suitcases. How could a young child be accused of collaboration? Petiot claimed. Neller told me he wanted to escape. I paid for his false papers out of my own pocket and asked him to leave me his furniture as collateral. Look, I'm not really very proud of this. They were Germans. They've probably already returned and are getting ready for the next war. On the 5th day of the trial, the court removed to Rue Le Sueur, and 300 policemen were stationed outside to hold back the crowds who turned up. They were unsuccessful, and soon chaos reigned as morbid spectators forced their way into the house. Lawyers and jurors had to enter the triangular cell, in which presumably the victims had died. In 3 shifts, in front of the manure pit, Petiot nearly fainted, but it was claimed that he was only weak from hunger. Throughout the following week and into the 3rd, some 80 witnesses were heard. They included relatives and friends of those who had disappeared, as well as psychiatrists and handwriting experts. Petiot maintained his calm, contemptuous pose, insisting that his killings had been patriotic. On April 3rd, the court heard the closing speeches for the prosecution and defense, and the jury duly retired. When Petiot was called to appear for the verdict, he was discovered sleeping peacefully. He was found guilty with no mitigating circumstances of the willful murder of 26 of those named in the charges.